Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us this morning for this Ask Gleaves seminar. Is this going to be the last Ask Gleaves this year? Or is there one more? One more. Okay, one more Ask Gleaves. I don't even know my own schedule, so this is always exciting to see what the next adventure is going to be. I start off always with the leadership life cycle because it's a starting point for so many of our Ask Gleaves seminars, not to belabor it this morning because many of you have already seen it. But these to me are the elements that are essential to understanding leadership. And what I always ask an audience is, please put yourself somewhere on this cycle. Where are you in your leadership development? Because some people are very much in leading themselves mode. As students, they're learning their ethical framework out of which they make decisions. They're learning how they relate to the world around them. And it's perfectly appropriate to continue as an apprentice leader to develop toward that authentic leadership that Brian likes to talk about and learning to lead yourself. And here's the little clue for you. You have to learn and revisit this idea of leading yourself for the rest of your lives. You never graduate from one of these. The second, following others. You know, we think of that as, oh, okay, when you're apprentice leaders, that's what is important because you're in a following mode. Again, you will never quit learning to listen to others. You will have experiences that will humble you, and you will have to follow. Sometimes you will have to follow others' wisdom, their advice. Hillary, come on in. You're in time. Just got started. Here you go, sir. Got something for you. Oh, that's okay. That's okay. And then eventually you have the opportunity as you develop to lead a team. It might be your family. Maybe you're a co-leader of your family. Or it might be a church group. Or it might be a civic organization where you have an interest in developing something, changing a vision and saying, you know, we can do better. And how do we go about doing this? And then leading an organization. The difference between a team and an organization for purposes of this chart is that a team, you know everybody by their first name. You know their significant others. You know how many kids they have. You know something about their lives. If they're having a bad day, you can walk up to them and you can say, you know, I just want to make sure everything's okay. How's your spouse doing today or whatever? Whereas leading an organization, it's too big for you to have that kind of personal relationship with everybody, so you have to learn further techniques to develop your leadership abilities. And that's where I often say this is where you magnify the message and you multiply the messengers. You still rely on the team that's close to you to do so. And then always on the leadership life cycle. It's the last element, but in some ways it's the catalytic element. It's crisis. Crisis, we live in an imperfect world. Crisis comes. And sometimes the crises are generated from within, inside you, because of an ethical lapse, or because you've been stupid, or you don't see what you need to see. And sometimes the crisis comes from without. A budget cut. Sometimes people who are envious and jealous and are out to get you. I mean, it does happen. You know, you've attained something and they want what you have and they try to undermine you. Or it could be an entity that's not so personal. It can just be impersonal forces. It could be like a takeover bid in a corporation. Whatever it is, you have to learn to deal with crises. Now, I thought what I would do today is something quite a bit different from what I usually do. Usually when I talk to you, as you know, I'm on my feet. I like to mix in with you and give you lots of eye contact and speak from the heart and from my experience. I'm going to be speaking very much from my heart today and very much from experience. But it's going to be from a book that I wrote a number of years ago. About 10 years ago, this book came out. And what I did in this book is I talked about my nearly 12 years with Governor John Engler. He was on, by the way, with Jennifer Granholm on This Week. With George Stephanopoulos just on Sunday morning. I don't know if you saw it or not. As they were talking about the importance of Michigan in the primary campaign. By the way, I hope everybody voted yesterday. He's a Michigan resident here. But what I want to do is go back to two crises in the Engler administration and share with you the words of the participants. The words are not my words. Okay, these are people that I interviewed. And I think you'll find them interesting. The first crisis has to do with Proposal A. It's the whole revamping of education in our state from the point of view of the participants. I interviewed 150 people in the course of writing this book. So there are lots of Republicans and conservatives, but there are an equal number of liberals and Democrats. in the book. So it's a balanced presentation of Proposal A. And I'll give you a little bit more background when we actually get to the specifics. The second thing that I would like to talk about is a crisis that came over because of rumor mongering. This is the ugliest thing that can happen in an organization. And John and Michelle Engler they had been married about 8 years, and rumors started and persisted and spread that they were getting a divorce. And I'm going to read to you what they did about it, because the rumors were working their way into newspapers in a very vicious and ugly way. So let's start a little bit of background for those of you. There are only a couple of you who probably really remember John Engler well. I'm going to close this door. Or Brian, could you do that, please? Thank you. Let me tell you just a little bit about John Engler, because it's very much a young person's story. It's a very compelling story. No matter what you thought of him politically, he was remarkable already as a college student. And when he was a junior at Michigan State University, he enrolled in a political science course, and he made as his paper how to defeat an incumbent and win an election. And he's somebody who took his college paper as a junior, and he actually did what the paper said, and he won. So that's how he got started as a 21-year-old, being elected as the youngest Michigan legislator. He knocked off 3 incumbents before his 30th birthday. He earned the nickname in Lansing of John the Giant Killer. He became Senate Majority Leader by the age of 35, so he was heading up that branch of government. He's, I think, one of the youngest Senate Majority Leaders in state history. And then he becomes one of the youngest governors in state history by the age of 42. And it's a remarkable story how he does it. But now I want you to fast forward 2 years into his administration. We're going to go to July 1993. I was serving on his staff as his speechwriter at that point. And on a hot July night, the Democrats did something that was considered quite bold. It would precipitate a crisis, and I want you to hear what John Engler would do. So will you forgive me? Will you indulge me as I read to you from this book? Okay. The breakthrough there are 2 issues here. There's how do you lower property taxes in this state, and how do you achieve meaningful education reform. The breakthrough would occur in the Michigan legislature on the evening of Tuesday, July 20th, 1993. All during the day, the Democratic caucus in the Senate met and agreed to have Debbie Stabenow, our current senator, well, she was State Senator Stabenow in those days, have Debbie Stabenow sponsor an amendment to SB 1, Senate Bill 1. Stabenow was given the go-ahead because she was running for governor. The amendment called for breathtakingly bold action, eliminating the property taxes that paid for public schools. This was a Democrat proposing to eliminate the entire fiscal basis for supporting public schools. Engler conferred with Democratic Minority Leader Art Miller and immediately sensed that the Democrats were bluffing. Given the Michigan Education Association's influence with Democrats, there was no way Stabenow could be serious. Democrats just wanted to embarrass Republicans going into the 1994 elections. It was a crucial electoral year because the governor, 38 senators, and 110 representatives were up for re-election. By having Republican lawmakers vote against SB 1, Democrats and, Stabenow in particular, who's a hopeful gubernatorial candidate, could truthfully say that Republicans were not really serious about cutting property taxes. They would keep the GOP on the defensive. That was the plan. So Engler decided to call the Democrats' bluff. He quickly brought in Senate Majority Leader Dick Posthumus, talked to Speaker Paul Hilligans at the time, and urged them to start working with the Republican caucus in the House. And everyone involved on both sides of the aisle has vivid, if diverging, memories of what then took place. Now, the interview, that's my head note, and here's some of the interviews. Here's Art Miller, the Democrat, opposed to Engler. It turned out to be quite a poker game that night. It started when Stabenow had this wild idea, get rid of property taxes to pay for schools. Initially, my Democratic caucus, there was a lot of doubt whether either caucus, Republican or Democrat, would accept such an idea, and would the governor buy it. And all my members needed to check with the MEA. You know, I got to stick with the MEA, they would say. What does the MEA want, they would say. Well, the MEA was sitting on the sidelines because they liked the fact that property taxes were generating a lot of income to pay for schools in Michigan. Their attitude was, why are we playing this game of Russian roulette? Besides, you know the governor isn't going to buy it. Were they in for a surprise? That's what Art Miller says. Patty Woodworth, budget director, had this to say. She's budget director for John Engler. She said this: I was with the governor in the Capitol when Debbie Stabenow introduced the amendment to eliminate property taxes as a funding source for education. She introduced it as a bluff or as a joke. Somebody came running in to tell us, and we all gathered because we needed to discuss it. There were arguments in staff, some saying, you need to take this opportunity, or you shouldn't take it, here's the danger. John Engler just listened. After everyone had spoken, he said, tell them to pass it. Tell them I'll sign it. Patty speaking, my stomach fell to the ground. I was afraid that if we eliminated all property taxes for school funding, we wouldn't get another reform, and in the meantime, the schools would be without funding. I felt it was walking to the brink of political suicide. So this is within Engler's staff, and she was one of his most trusted advisors. Joanne Emmons, who comes to many of our programs, was a state senator, and she said this: I will never forget that night. I was the new chair of the Finance Committee. We had recently brought forward several property tax proposals, and I had another one that evening, but frankly, it wasn't very good. Then we heard the rumor that Debbie Stabenow was going to propose abolishing property taxes for school operating expenses. Republicans went into caucus and agreed to go for it. About 7:30 that night, Dick Posthumus said to me, just talk. Go out on the Senate floor and buy some time. Argue against Debbie's amendment. I need to talk to the governor one last time to make sure this is really what he wants to do. About 7:30 or so, so Dick talked to the governor, and the governor said, go for it. And Debbie had her amendment voted on, and we voted overwhelmingly for it. So these are Republicans voting for the Democrats' amendment. As the votes went up on the board, Debbie was nervously pacing. When the amendment passed, the look on her face was, what have I just done? She looked as if she could barely breathe. She looked as if somebody had hit her in the gut and knocked the wind out of her. She had no idea that this was going to happen, and the MEA that had set her up had no idea that this was going to happen. Heads were going to roll. Paul Hilligans has an interesting thought. He was my neighbor, by the way, at this time. So he's out cutting his lawn earlier that evening. I saw him, and then he said, I'll never forget. I was at home making hamburgers with my wife and got a call from the governor and from Dick Posthumus. Guess what just happened, the governor began. Would you be prepared to move on the elimination of property taxes in the House tomorrow morning? Cautious person that I am, I thought, this is a huge risk. This could destroy us Republicans. If the Democrats allow us to go over a cliff, and the governor could see that I was reluctant. I mean, this is the House leader. No one is going to allow that to happen, the governor responded. But Paul, if you don't move quickly, nothing is going to happen. If you sit on this, all the cautious lawmakers and interest groups and the cautious editorial writers and the cautious public opinion will make this a lost opportunity. By the end of the conversation, he and Dick had convinced me. He had made the promise on property taxes and was willing to take the risk to fulfill that promise. My wife, Nancy, was as astounded as I was. And then I have some passages in here from what the newspapers said. The reporters were following this. and how it unrolled. Al Short, the chief lobbyist of the Michigan Education Association, as I interviewed him for his story, he said, "I'll never forget that night in July when the Senate was in session. They'd come back from a break, and Debbie Stabenow, out of the blue, offered the proposal to call the bluff of the Republicans." And then Al talks about everything that's happening, from his point of view. Let's see if there's anything else that I want to... Yeah, there's one last passage from Mark Haas. I was detailed by the governor, along with 9 others, to actually work on the committee to do 3 things. But basically, we had to replace revenues. We had to find a proposal to replace revenues, and that's why we have a 6-cent sales tax in this state. And one of the justifications for that is property taxes, you have to realize back then, had gotten so high for so many Michigan residents that people were paying more for their property tax than their mortgage. And it was driving people to Florida. All the Michiganders down in Florida, this is when that flight really started. The second justification for proposing the sales tax was that everybody has to buy stuff. And of course, we exempt groceries, pharmaceuticals, farm equipment, and utilities from the sales tax. So we protect the poor that way. But the sales tax is also paid for by all the tourists who come in our state. And back then, Michigan was the 7th leading tourist destination in the United States. So the rationale was, have all of these tourists also supporting our schools. So it was a rational tax. This was 1993, but Proposal A actually passes on the Ides of March, March 15th, 1994. Almost 20 years ago now. So Mark Haas is one of the 10 of us who are serving on this committee to create this kind of education revolution and fiscal revolution in the state. And Mark said this: "The remarkable thing about Proposal A is how Engler managed to pull together so much. It started out as a bluff and a bill to replace school funding. But Engler seized the opportunity to make it so much more, an opportunity to improve public education, increase accountability, help teachers develop professionally, start charter schools, and much else. That's leadership." This governor is different from the 2 previous governors I worked for. He has a more complete understanding, a more in-depth knowledge of the issues he cares about. When we were working on the legislative language for Proposal A, we would meet at his house on Sunday afternoons. We all had big, thick 4-inch notebooks crammed with details about all the various bills that were being drafted up. Someone would be discussing some minute aspect of some particular bill, and the governor would say, "Well, what you're suggesting contradicts what was said on page 117 of this other notebook. We have to reconcile it." That was what working with Engler was like. He was just a brilliant strategist. And he had the capacity, the imagination to see what would have taken many other politicians or many other public servants down, or they would have just said, Senator Stabenow has put us in a corner on this, what do we do? He immediately saw the possibilities of her, how do I say it, her joke, because she wasn't serious. And he was one of the few people in the state who saw the possibilities right then and there. And Proposal A now is history, and we've lived under that for almost 20 years. Whatever you think of Proposal A, and there are many efforts, of course, to modify it. It wasn't perfect, but it did even out the disparity between the rich and the poor districts, which absolutely this state had to tackle. Because you had, Forest Hills and Grosse Pointe, they were getting $10,000 a child, and then you had Kalkaska getting $1,700. And Engler said, that's got to stop. Everybody's got to start making, everybody should be getting what Forest Hills and Grosse Pointe is getting. We've got to get over that disparity, because if you have such unequal education, you're hurting so many children in this state. So that's what we were able to do with school finance, and very, very proud. It's funny, Doug Roberts is addressed, several people, John Truscott, several of us who worked at this period of time. We look back on that period as one of the most interesting times in our lives to be a part of that history. But it started because Engler was such an incredible guy to work for. And to be with a person who had that strategic vision was just a thrilling opportunity. So that's the first part of the topic that I wanted to address. How do you deal with a public crisis? Well, you can imagine somebody who's in public office for 12 years, 32 years total, but in the governor's office for 12 years, had some private crises, personal crises come along because there are some mean-spirited people out there who resented the fact that he was successful and he knew how to move the state forward according to his agenda. And so some very ugly people started a rumor. They started the rumor that he and his wife were going to get a divorce. And we know where the rumor started. There are no names, however, in the book because you don't want to dignify people who talk like that. But I want to share with you how his mind worked when these very ugly people started to come after him personally. Here's my head note for this. In politics, there is always more than meets the eye. So much happens behind the scenes. Throughout the early months of 1997, John Engler was weighing the pros and cons of running for a third term. The decision was not coming easily for him and Michelle. Their announcement was pushed up by an unfortunate incident involving news reporters and editors formally, but a lot of operatives behind the scenes informally. This incident infuriated Engler, and it also revealed his strategic mind and his determination not to be bested by petty people. John Truscott recalls, "For 6 months, the rumor mill had been running rampant. The Englers' marriage was on the rocks, and Michelle had packed up and taken the triplets to Texas. We were all sick of hearing it. I used to tell the journalists who'd ask about the impending divorce, show up at the next event the governor was scheduled to appear at and ask him about it, or go to the next event where the governor and Michelle would appear jointly and ask them directly." Only one reporter, Lisa Zagaroli, dared to ask Engler about it to his face. And this is John Truscott's his report here. The press didn't really think it was true, but because of the competition, they didn't want to be scooped either. In June of 1997, the Detroit News decided to write a story about it. It was to be called The Anatomy of a Rumor. Their goal was to raise the marriage issue, but without confirming it. This is journalism at its lowest. Accuse somebody, but don't produce any documents to prove it. And it's scandalous that journalists would do this. It's scandalous that this ever happens in life, but this is the world we live in. So their goal was to start to raise the marriage issue without confirming it. They started to write the story and wanted the governor's viewpoint. When we found out what they were up to, we started researching how journalists should handle rumors. We looked at the ethical standards taught at places like Columbia and Missouri, there's journalism schools, and we're confident that it was unethical for the Detroit News to run a story based on rumors, especially one ginned up by political opponents. So we met with people from the news in the governor's conference room. Our viewpoint was, if you can prove the rumor's true, go for it. If it's true, you have an obligation. But if it's a rumor, you have the obligation to be quiet and not spread it. So we met at noon for an hour. Michelle, who was up on Mackinac Island, was on the speakerphone. It was a very tense meeting. The governor answered all the questions forthrightly. At the end, somebody stood up, and Charlie Kane of the Detroit News said the news was going to run the story because they had the governor's quotations. Well, I know Charlie. I'm sure that he did not really want to do this story, but there was pressure on him from the publisher to do it. The governor was not happy. He knew that we had lost this battle, but that we would still win this war. We went back into the room, and the governor started strategizing with Michelle on the speakerphone. It was obvious that the two of them had had private conversations about his running again, but this was just accelerating their timetable. Michelle said, "Maybe I should make the announcement and let people know that I support you. I support you running for re-election." The governor agreed, saying, "Well, that will make the news all right." So we developed our strategy between 1 and 1:15 that afternoon. We decided that Michelle would make the announcement. She would come back down from the island and do it in person. So about 1:15, I called the Detroit Free Press, the rival of the Detroit News. I asked their political reporter, Dawson Bell, "Are you ready for one of the biggest scoops of the year?" "Heck yes, I'm interested. What is it?" "Let's just meet at the Lansing residence at 5 o'clock this afternoon." So now I pick up the story from Dawson's point of view, whom I've interviewed for this. When JT called, his voice had that campaign mode sound of it. I knew right away that something was up. He said he had a big story. Could I meet the First Lady out of the governor's residence? He added, "You'll definitely want to bring a photographer along." I said, "Not if I don't have more information. The photographers are busy." JT gave me just enough information that I was 99% sure the interview would be about the governor's re-election decision. Based on that premise, I started writing the story before I went to the residence. I knew that I was being used, but in this instance, I didn't mind. It was a good story. Truscott. Michelle came in, hot from the ride back from the island. She was so nervous her hands were shaking. She asked if she had time to take a shower. I told her, "Whatever you need to do to feel ready for this interview, do it." So she took a shower, settled down, composed herself, and then she gave the interview of her life. Back to Dawson Bell. Michelle is always a great interview, but this time she seemed so nervous at the start. I could tell that she was feeling strong emotions. She was really angry at the rumors and the people who were spreading the rumors. And then I include the article that actually appeared in here. And it goes to show, because what ended up happening is the Detroit News thought that they had their big announcement about the divorce. And Engler, instead of getting emotional about it, he was very angry to be sure, but he used his head. And he said, rather than just react to that, I will create a bigger story, put the rumor aside, and make the news and the people who are spreading these rumors look absolutely foolish. And that's what he did. You see, ladies and gentlemen, he took a crisis. People were trying to take him down. And he took that crisis and he turned it around and he turned it against them. And there was never any more talk about his private life and the breakup, supposedly, of his marriage. Now, all of us who were around Engler, we were around him and we saw how rumors had affected him. He was unhappy with it. He's a much more sensitive man than you would have known from the media that typically reported on him. But we were all amazed at how he stayed calm and he stayed focused. And he made sure that he would not be bested. Yes, he might lose a battle, but he would win the war. That's leadership, taking a crisis that's below the belt and turning it around on your opponents. So I share that with you from my personal experience of dealing with a leader at close range and how he worked, whether it's the largest public policy issue the state faced in the 1990s with the abolition of school finance and turning that around to advantage, or something that hit below the belt, close to home, about two people's marriage. And I hope that you've enjoyed these little stories. The book is full of other stories. It's unfortunately no longer in print. You'd have to get it used or go to the library to read it. But there are a lot of such stories in it, but not quite as intense. So thank you very much for your attention.